Now, in many parts of the world, there is a sense of returning confidence for many businesses as the grip of the pandemic slowly begins to loosen. But worryingly, one measure of the return of economic activity is the renewed rise of the price of food. According to the United Nations, global food prices have risen at their fastest pace for more than a decade, stoking fears of how they'll affect the economic recovery from the pandemic. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization survey found that food prices were up almost 40% in May compared to the same month last year. All 5 components of the index rose, led by the surge in vegetable oils, grains and sugar. Suppliers have been affected by disruptions to production, labor and transport during the pandemic, and this has had a bigger impact in developing countries like Nigeria, where households spend a greater part of their disposable income on food. But could higher grocery bills also be an incentive in the long term to increase supply in the developing world? Well, for her considered analysis, I'm joined now from London by Arise International Business Correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie. Give us, first of all, a brief summary of what that UN survey is telling us about the cost of food globally. I mean, that's quite a high increase there.
The one number that sticks out, Charles, is 40%. Food prices have increased by 40% inside of a year. And during that year, Charles, many people outside of the developed world have actually had their incomes fall. Many people are unable to get to work because of COVID. A lot of informal jobs have disappeared. So at the same time that people's paychecks are disappearing, we have food prices rising by 40% a year. Now, there are a number of reasons for this food price rise, and they may not necessarily be sustainable. You mentioned in the introduction logistical problems. Transport wasn't in the right places when COVID struck, and so there are bottlenecks in shipping. Those could continue for some time yet. Poor drought in Brazil, that has affected some commodities prices. U.S. farmers planted a bit less last year, so yields are lower. So it's a whole combination of factors. Also, greater demand from a recovering China, and as China develops, they're eating more meat and fewer grains, although grains did increase in price as well as pork. But that is pushing up the price of pork, but this rise was across the board. So many reasons for this rise in food prices. The supply bottlenecks, the transport issues, they will work themselves out, but it could take the rest of the year for that to work out. Things like farmers planting less in the U.S., weather-related issues with global warming, that could become an issue. So there are many reasons to think that while some of the issues pushing up food prices will abate, not all of them will.
And of course, Laurie, dramatic food price rises are always a politically and socially charged issue, aren't they? Particularly in the developing world, where a significant percentage of household incomes go to purchasing food. I mean, when the price of corn, for example, shot up fourfold in Mexico a few years ago, it sparked riots on the streets of Mexico. And this year, I understand the price has pushed up again by 2/5 or more.
Absolutely, Charles. We have seen social unrest in various parts of the world, in North Africa, in the Middle East, when food prices have risen. And nowhere is this more acute, Charles, than Nigeria. Nigerians spend between 50 and 60% of their disposable income on food. In America, the comparison is about 6%. And it looks like, from my research, Nigerians spend a greater portion of their disposable income on food than any other country in the world. So when you have food inflation rising by almost 23% a year, which is where it was the last inflation data that we got out of Nigeria, it really hurts. And Charles, if you don't mind, let me turn things around. Are you noticing the prices of things rising? Despite my advanced years, I don't have a recollection of inflation being very high in the developed world. In the early 1970s, prices were rising at about 10% in a year in the US, and that was outrageously high for Americans. You're now looking at 23% for food. Can you see it, Charles, when you're out shopping? Are Nigerians feeling this?
Well, certainly, to reveal a thing or two about me, I don't actually go out to do the shopping myself, but from what I hear,
I thought I probably
from what I hear of people saying, and you're certainly right to ask that question. That's a very legitimate one. Food prices have absolutely skyrocketed in Nigeria here. So you're right on the mark, Laurie. And I was going to ask you, what sense are you getting about how people are coping with these price increases generally around the world?
Well, food prices in the developed markets, where my knowledge is the greatest, we are seeing food prices rise, but we're looking at 2 to 3% on an annual basis. And of course, in an economy like the U.S., where 6% of spending is on food, in the U.K. and Europe, it's a little bit higher, between 8 and 9%. You can see it, but it doesn't take so much of your disposable income. It isn't as painful. It's something that people discuss, but it's not something that we can almost see before our eyes. You're not seeing prices rise on say, a daily or a weekly basis, so it doesn't feel quite as painful. That said, inflation is a worry in the developed world. In fact, it's the biggest worry that economists have right now. The biggest economic debate going on right now in the developed world is this rise in inflation that we're seeing to between 2 and 3% across the developed world. Will this be sustainable? And economists are not in agreement on that at all.
And of course, Laurie, that's an absolutely critical point about inflation, and I want to return to that if we have time a bit later in the chat. But you might have touched on this earlier. I want to be clear on the reason for these food price rises. Is that pressure on supply?
It's a supply phenomena more than a demand phenomena, Charles. There is greater demand coming from China, the world's biggest food market, but it is more a supply issue. Funny weather in a number of agricultural countries. I mentioned Brazil, Australia as well. And those supply bottlenecks, transport links not being where they are. So it much more is on the supply side. The transport supply issues can be worked out, but things like abnormal weather, which we've seen much, much more of over the past decade, that is difficult to predict. That could wreak havoc with harvests across the world, from South America to India.
So, I mean, Laurie, you've got quite a bit of experience in these things. You've been a business correspondent in different places around the world. What are your food price predictions going forward in real terms, adjusted for, CPI, inflation, etc., and looking at both the demand and supply side of things?
Well, certainly when you have population growth, particularly in Africa, and Africa is the region of the world that has the highest population growth by far, Charles. So there will always be increasing demand. We also have a phenomenon where as countries become more industrialized, as they become richer, they eat different sorts of food, they eat more meat. So there will always be some pressure on the demand side. On the supply side, as I mentioned, big concerns over weather change, climate change. Will the sorts of things that have grown in certain regions for decades, for centuries, will they be viable? Will they be feasible if climate does change as dramatically as many people predict? But there's another side to inflation, Charles, that we also need to talk about, and this is hard commodity. When we talk about agricultural products, we're talking about soft commodities, grain, wheat, corn, as you mentioned. But something else is going on. There's also been inflation in raw materials, iron ore, Copper prices have been near a record high. Oil prices have more than doubled from their price a year ago. In fact, in April of last year, oil prices were negative for a short period of time. We're now above $70 a barrel. Now, some of these hard commodities that I've mentioned, iron ore, copper, aluminium is at a multi-year high, nickel at a multi-year high. These things are dug out of the ground largely in developing countries, not least in Africa. So there's one part of the inflation picture that is actually beneficial to African countries, and that's the rise in commodities prices. And if we look at Nigeria, oil, as last I checked, was just over $71 a barrel. What the Nigerian government has budgeted for this year is oil at $40 a barrel. So revenues into the Nigerian treasury should be much, much higher than that were expected a year ago. The question is, what does the government do? The government will be looking at some kind of a windfall. The question is, will countries that are looking at higher revenues from commodities price increases, will they use that money to help cushion the blow of food price inflation?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, you've been looking at all the figures and the trends in many of these countries. I mean, this is not the first time they're having a windfall. What is your sense of what they've done with those windfalls? I mean, is it, for instance, likely to offset the increasing price of food this time around?
It certainly depends, Charles, on how governments choose to spend these windfalls. And in much of the developing world, natural resource companies are fully or partially state-owned, so that the increased revenues can flow directly to the state. In more developed worlds, if you look at somewhere like ExxonMobil or Chevron, the increased revenues flow to the company. That goes back into government coffers in the form of corporate tax. That's less the case in the developing world. But what governments choose to spend this money on is a very big question. And I think the fact, Charles, that the developing world economists have been talking a lot about food price inflation and how painful this is, and by extension, there's been low-level talks about more help for developing countries, increasing. The IMF is looking at a wide program by increasing what's called special drawing rights. This is a hybrid currency. These will be released to developed world nations to allow them to lend to developing nations. Low-level talks about forgiving developing world debt. These are all very important things to do, but I think the fact that these talks are going on at a low level means that economists do not have very much faith that this increased revenue from commodities, from natural resources, will be shared amongst the people in these developing world countries.
And Laurie, we've got less than a minute. What about the other side of the food price rise story? Could higher grocery bills also be an incentive in the long term to increase supply of food in the developing world? Briefly.
That's the eternal question, Charles, and nowhere is that more relevant than in Nigeria. Nigeria has had a plan to diversify away from oil for as long as you and I can remember. This would be a time to apply those resources to more, a wider range of industry. Whether this happens or not, very, very big question. But nowhere in Africa have we seen all that many examples of governments using windfall profits to diversify their economies.
Thank you very much indeed. Very, very interesting and enlightening. Laurie Laird, our international business correspondent, talking to me there from London.